Well, I think it's a good time to freak out, don't you? Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back to A Fictional Escapist. My name is Kris, and today's video is the mid-year freakout book tag. This is one of those tags which I do enjoy doing each year here on the platform because it's a good look at what you've done in the first half of the year. Be that read 200 books like some people I know, or like myself who has read a very modest 40 but enjoyed most of what I've read. I just think it's a good way to touch base, so we're going to go ahead and do it today. Before we jump into the tag, make sure you're checking the description box down below for links to my social media and Discord, should you want to come along for the ride. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not going to tag anyone. It's all over YouTube, and I'm always late to the party when it comes to the mid-year freakout tags, so you've probably seen a few of them already so far. But if you haven't done it and you want to go ahead and do it, the prompts will be down below for you. So, let's jump in. So the first prompt that we have on this particular tag is the best book you've read so far in 2024. And because we are booktubers and none of us stick to this rule, I've got a few to shout about. The first one is going to be a short story collection by Eric LaRocca called The Trees Grew Because I Bled There. Eric LaRocca is someone I've talked about time and time again as being wildly underrated in the horror space. This book is actually about love and humanity. And I think horror really lends itself quite well to going into some of the darker parts of those particular topics. I really love this book. There's a couple of stories here which stood out to me, and some of them are only a couple of pages long, but the one that I'm going to try and remember it because it was a little while ago that I read it. The one is The Trees Grew Because I Bled There was fantastic. But there was also a story called, I think it was You're Not Supposed to Be Here, which was one of the longer stories here. But there was just every book or every story in this was fantastic, and I can't wait to read more. Eric LaRocca, hopefully later in the year. The other one is going to be a sequel to a series I started a couple of years ago, or a year ago, but that's going to be Light Fighters by Palmer Pickering. So I read Moon Deeds a little while ago. I listened to it on audio. This book is fantastic, and it makes me so excited for the series to continue, which is just what you want from book 2. I was so sucked in. This book, and I've mentioned it before, does really well on that slow burn epic world build, making me super invested in the characters and in the world and what's happening, while also always progressing. So because there is a few different cast members and we're seeing their wider world, they are always progressing forward in their own story within this, or their own arc within this particular world. So even though there was a lot of depth to it, it was also always moving. And I think that takes a lot of skill to be able to do that and pair that well, to have something that is quite slow, a slow read and a big read. It's 800 pages, but make me want to keep turning that page, make me addicted to it, which is just fantastic. And the other one I'll bring up here is one I've probably talked about a few times now, which is The Council of Athesia by D.H. Hoskins. Now, this really takes political fantasy on its head and does something different. It looks at the inner workings of what would normally happen behind the scenes in a political fantasy, and we are looking at a literal council. So the big bad of the world, the Osmancer, has been defeated. It's been 25 years that they've been in a war. All of these factions and all these different fantasy creatures had to come together within their own worlds to defeat this big bad. What happens after that, and how do we keep the peace? A council is called. They have representatives from like 40 different factions and races and things like that. And drama ensues because that many people, that many differing opinions in one room, and it was just delicious for someone who likes political fantasy. The next prompt we have here is the best sequel you've read so far in 2024. Now, that probably would go to Light Fighters as well, but I will bring up a new one here, which is going to be The Rascal Plains by Phil Tucker, which is up there. This is the second book in a progression fantasy, and I would say that this is progression fantasy at its finest. We are following Scorio and Co. I won't give too much away because it is a book 2, as they move on to the Rascal Plains in this particular world. What I loved about this, again, very similarly to Palmer's book, is a slow burn when we come to building the world and the characters and bringing that emotional depth into that second book. But because it is a progression fantasy, we have to progress. We have to continually do things to up levels, to learn new skills, to go to new areas. And that is done really well in this book. I also just love the friendships in this book. I think it's done really well. And something I really appreciate is they're not necessarily sexual friendships. Like, you know, hey, different genders will get close to one another and then all of a sudden they're a couple. It's not, at least in this book, it's not that way inclined. They just get to be friends. And I think that is something that should be done more, where you can have friends that you love but are still just friends, because it does happen in real life, I promise you. The next one here we have is new release you haven't read but you want to. And for these, I'm going to go with one trad and one indie. So the trad book that I would like to read this year is going to be Empire of the Damned, which came out in March, I want to say, and I haven't read it yet. I bought it on release, I pre-ordered it. I loved Empire of the Vampire, but I've not read the second book. So that is going to be the trad pub entry, and one I talked about liking political fantasy. It's going to be the Crimson Court. It's been on my TBR for like 3 months. I haven't read it yet. So this released this year as well, and I really do need to get to it soon. At some point, it will happen. The next prompt is the most anticipated fantasy release for the second half of the year. And oh boy, do we have a bunch of indie sequels coming out that I will drop everything for. The first is going to be Graveyard to Heroes, or A Graveyard to Heroes, by Michael Michelle, follow up to The Price of Power. I'm really hoping that that comes out before the end of the year, because I would love to demolish that book the second that it's available. We have Carved on Flawed Dreams by M.T. Fontaine, who was also one of my anticipated releases last year when I did this video, which is just coincidental. I love that series and I'm waiting for the next book, which I think is going to be a late release this year. We also had The Heart of Quinaria Book 2. I don't have the title for that one yet, or at least I don't remember if it's been released, and if it has, and I know it, I don't want to say it, but I can't remember anyway, so it's not a problem. This is by B.S.H. Garcia, the follow-up to Of Thieves and Shadows. I'll put the first book up here because it might jog people's memories. So I think that's coming out this year as well. I'm very much looking forward to it. And the other, which I don't know if they're going to be 2024 releases or 2025 releases, but we'll put it out there. We will manifest positive things out into the world. Is going to be Cole and Morgan by L.L. McRae. This is books 5 and 6 in the world of Lunaria. But I think there's some talk about potentially pushing those books into one and finishing it with one big book. So we will see. We'll see what happens in that space. But if it comes out this year, I will be jumping on that one. I'm currently reading the 4th book, which will have me up to date with that series. The next one is going to be The Biggest Disappointment. Now, this, I don't know if it's a hot take or not, but I read this book with Taylor from May Between the Pages and also Luke over at Luke's Books Nook, and I'll put those channels down below. This was Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey. This is a quintessential classic fantasy, and a lot of people love the series. I think it was a product of its time. It was not a product for me. And I think there are arguments to be had for and against that, like product of its time, but is it still bad? Were we still promoting the wrong things at that time? Which I would probably argue yes in the case of this book, but it still had some really cool elements. Where it fell down for me was definitely the treatment of its female characters and what they were expected to do, and that not like other girls thing where one was just superior to other women in every single way. And like there was a scene that happened which was so unnecessary where it basically said, I'm basically just raping my wife, but she'll get used to it. And I was like, no, not about it. So that was probably the biggest disappointment, because I thought that it would be charming and whimsical, and the prose was, but there were just some things in the book which were a bit yuck. So I DNF'd the series. I tried the second book, but yeah, DNF'd the series overall. The next prompt is a favorite new author. So for this one, it's going to, again, trying to move away from doing double ups here of people. So D.H. Hoskins is someone I'm definitely going to be looking forward to more of. But the author I'm going to showcase here is going to be Lucas Lex de Jong, who wrote Harrow, which is one of my first reads of the year. This is a folklore horror, small town horror, big chunky book, which I would liken to Stephen King's It, except without the yuck things that happened in Stephen King's It. Yuck from a moral perspective rather than like the horror elements, because that's the whole point of the book. But really enjoyed this. Very good slow burn folklore. If you haven't gathered, love a slow burn. So this was just great. There's like crazy matriarchy. Freaking love it. Like woods, creepy woods. Love it. Ritual sacrifices. Love it. Love it. So yeah, really enjoyed that. Very much looking forward to reading more from this author. Next prompt is the biggest surprise of 2024 so far. That is going to be Raider or Radar by Tracy M. Joyce. Now, this was a surprise because the protagonist of this story is 6 years old. And I didn't know a dark fantasy, a dark adult fantasy, having a 6-year-old protagonist, how I would go with that. It was great. It was so good. The 6-year-old, or rather the namesake of the book, is so charming. And the book was much more than just that one character, but it does center very much on this 6-year-old and going through trauma and how her parents teaching her to grow up, but sort of trying to still let her be a kid. And it was whimsical and wonderful, but still incredibly dark as a story. So that was definitely the biggest surprise that I've had this year. Now, the next prompt is interesting because I don't read to be happy, but the prompt is book that made you happy. I once joked with someone that I like being stressed all the time because I tend to gravitate towards darker things or heavy drama and really wanting to unpack the psychological aspects of those things. So, reading a happy book, I don't tend to gravitate towards cozy. I have read a couple that I've enjoyed, but normally they fall a bit flat for me, or they'll be 3-star reads. I'll be fine, and I'll use them to break up some bigger series, but I don't tend to gravitate towards happy. So for this one, I am going to go with Starsight by Brandon Sanderson, which is a YA sci-fi series. I do read this when I need a break from dark. So that's when I've been slotting in this series. So I read Starsight and the first 2 novellas of whatever the middle collection is. And Spencer is charming. Again, there's dark things that happen in this series, but it is very charming for Spencer and the crew and learning friendships and all of that. So I guess that is probably the only one that would fit into the happy. Newest fictional crush. I don't really get these, I don't tend to have crushes on people in books. And I've started reading more romance and romantasy, so I don't know, maybe that'll change. But I would still say the Nightmare Lady from the Rascal Plains is someone that I would probably follow around like a puppy dog. Um, I'm pretty sure I read the first book last year, and I'm pretty sure that was the answer for last year as well. So, it's still true. The next one is going to be my newest favorite character. And again, I don't tend to gravitate towards main characters as favorites. I tend to go on to side characters. And this book surprised me because I didn't know how I would go. Not being real into superheroes, I don't like Marvel, I don't like DC, and I've just never gravitated towards superhero stories. So for Rohan from Wistful Ascending to be probably my newest favorite character and my newest favorite protagonist is something. I loved the humanity of Rohan, and I liked his quick-witted and his just overall good guyness. The good guy who wants to be left alone, and I feel that in my soul. So Rohan is someone that feels like he has to help. There's a darker side to him. He can punch people. he can fuck people up. Okay, let's just say that. He was once very powerful, and he may have to be again. I've only read the first book, don't spoil anything for me. But what I really liked about Rohan in Wistful Ascending was that he had this good guy mentality. I want to be a good person, I want to do my job and go home and just be a decent human being. But he gets pulled into this situation and he goes, I don't really want to do that, but I'm also not an asshole and I can do that, therefore I should do that. And he just keeps being put into these situations where he feels like he needs to go and help, and he goes and does that because he is, under it all, a very good human. And he just wants to help and fight for what is right, and that really resonated with me. So I quite liked Rohan. The next prompt is the book that made you cry. Now, I don't really do that. I've mentioned this a number of times. It takes a lot for me to have an emotional experience when reading. And look, there's probably an argument to go and get checked out for, just things. But I did have an emotional reaction to a couple of books for another reason, and that is going to be because they hit very close to home with a topic that I'm passionate about, but I do not talk about, and that is going to be depression. So there are a few different places in these books which I had to put down and go and check that I was feeling mentally okay before going on with the story, and that was My Heart of the Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones and also Inferno. so Dante's Inferno. There was a particular canon in this book, Canon 13, I've talked about it on another tag, that really got me. And because I was reading this alongside a notes app or a notes website, where if I didn't understand something, I would go and read the in-depth um, sort of notes behind what it meant in there. But that one just like knife directly in the heart for those. So I didn't cry, but I did have some sort of emotion behind it. So I guess those will fit there. The next one is, and the second to last, is the most beautiful book you've bought so far this year. It has in brackets or received. I'm going to go with received, and that is going to be, say what you will about him, but the book is beautiful. Neon Ghosts by Daniel Green. Now, this book really sparked my appreciation for how much a writer can grow. We will say this book's great. It has a lot of familiar beats to cyberpunk, so if you like the genre, you're going to like it. It has a fresh take on vampires. It's got urban fantasy elements in there. It was such a cool genre blend. But not only is this beautiful, I can't show you that page because there is human anatomy on it, which I don't think YouTube appreciates, but the naked hardcover is also just stunning. And there's artwork in here. It came with a bookmark. So this is a metal bookmark, which is just beautiful. I've got a sticker hanging out over there. We've got some edge papers. Just Wraithmark really know how to do a special edition. And I don't back that many Kickstarters these days, but it is a beautiful book. It feels great. The quality is fantastic. So probably that one. I say I haven't backed a lot of Kickstarters. Anyway, the last book we have here is what books you need to read by the end of the year. I will say that my outlook on this question has changed quite a bit, even from last year to this year. And that is, you don't need to read any amount of books. That, read what you want to, read when you want to, enjoy it, love it. That's what we want. In terms of answering the question, there are a few things that I would like to read and a few things that I definitely have planned to read this year. These are mainly finishing off series and also in the trad pub space, because I'm starting a podcast with a good friend of mine, and there are a few things that we want to talk about in there. But the first one that I would like to read the entire series this year that I'll talk about is the Mask of Mirrors. This is the Rook and Rose series. I don't know what it's called. Yeah, Rook and Rose by M.A. Carrick. I've got all three books. They're up on that shelf there that I would love to read this year as just another series to get under my belt. One that I'll be reading for this podcast is going to be the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. So my mate Ryan that I'm doing the podcast with, is a big sci-fi fan. And I wanted to read this for a while. So this is one that we were going to read and do a discussion on. So all three books, this is just an omnibus bind up. I'd like to read Empire of the Damned, which I had on here, which I'd like to get to by the end of this year. In terms of some indie that I would like to read, a couple of Spiffbo entries that we have, but also finishing off the Forging of Age duology by Tariana Obe. So I've got Dragon Your Bones Left, which I'll put the cover up here. I'd like to read Threshold of the Universe by T.A. Bruno and close off the Song of Kamaria series, again, which I'll put up there. And there are a few other bits and pieces. So I would also like to read The River of Stars by Lily Ann Crow, and also the third book in The Will of the Wayfinder, I think that series is called. So just a few things to tidy up, but you don't have to read what you don't want to. I'm embracing the mood read, whatever. Or the mood. I'm embracing moods this year. Anyway, that was the mid-year freak out book tag or update, whatever you want to call it. If you want to go ahead and do this one and you haven't, please go ahead and do it. If you like the content, give it one of those. If you want to see more of it, click subscribe at your will. And I'll catch you in the next video. Ciao.